Good afternoon. We would like today in our discussion to speak about some of the major elements related to the Pesach Seder. But before getting into some of the halachic details, I'd like to speak a little about the essence of Pesach evening as it is reflected in the course of Jewish history and according to our rabbinical literature. Part of the discussion related to this is found in the poem that is said at the Seder table, known as Vahi B'Chatzir Layla, what happened at midnight, which is one of the poems which is found at the end of the Seder, which we sing towards the end, but many people are already a little bit impatient by then. And certainly to give long discourses and discussions by that hour is unrealistic. So either you do it on Chol HaMoed or before Pesach or some other time. And I'd like to devote a little bit of time to that at this moment. The Ramban in his commentary to Bereshit, Parshas Lech Lecha, Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Vav, mentions as a general principle in Jewish thought that Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim, what our patriarchs did, become a symbol for us in the years to come. In many issues that Avram and the patriarchs were involved later on in the course of Jewish history, we had encounters that are related. The Ramban in particular makes a big issue about that in Parshas Lech Lecha itself. He, for example, criticizes Avram Avinu for going to Egypt due to the famine in Canaan and claims that part of the problem that we had later on, that the Jews got to Egypt because of the famine carried on, including the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the 210 years of servitude before. Namely, if there was a hunger during the time of Avram, a famine, he went down to Egypt. When Yitzchak, in his time, there was a famine, he was thinking of going to Egypt, and Hashem says to him, don't go there, you stay in Eretz Yisrael. But Yaakov Avinu already says by him in Perek Mem Gimel of Bereshis, in Parshat Miketz, Arav Kaved Baaretz, the famine was very strong in Eretz Yisrael, and he went to Egypt, first of all, his kids, who met Yosef over there, and eventually Binyamin went there, and then Yaakov himself came. So part of the overall story of the servitude in Egypt, which had other reasons, of course, of the sale of Yosef, etc., are also related anciently to the decision of Avram Avinu to go to Egypt at that time. Admittedly, there are some who claim that that's one of the 10 trials that Avram Avinu had encountered, and he, according to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, he made correct decisions in all 10 of the trials that he had gone through, which seemed to imply that that actually was not a negative decision. The Maharal and others take issue with the Ramban's opinion about that in Parshas Lech Lecha, but it's important to understand that a standard was set over there, that what our early leaders did set a standard for later on in the course of history. Even Sarah, who later on in the same parsha tortured a little bit Hagar in her behavior. Eventually, the Ramban says that we suffered from the Yishmaelim as a result of this for many a generation. Yaakov Avinu mentions 8 times in his approach towards Esav, he flatters and calls himself a servant. And the Ramban says that's one of the reasons why the Judean people later on suffered from the Romans, who are traditionally the descendants of Esav. When Yaakov asks too much in a slavery type of attitude, even if his intention, of course, was positive, it becomes a negative thing. And he quotes the Medrash, which criticizes Yaakov's behavior there, and finds a long-term curse, a long-term cause in history that occurred as a result. The first time in a positive sense that Avram Avinu actually operated in Parshas Lech Lecha, according to Chazal, was in what you'd call the First World War. Not in 1914 in Europe, but rather in chapter 14 of Genesis, Parshas Lech Lecha, Perek Yud Dalet, when the 4 kings attacked the 5 kings who refused to pay their taxes like they did before and served them. And the 4 kings were led by Kedor LaOmer. The story became part of our Torah because Lot, Avram's nephew, was taken in captivity. Shortly beforehand, Avram decided to depart and to separate from Lot because of the behavior of his shepherds. But that didn't cause Avram Avinu any second thought to try to make an effort to save Lot from captivity, even though it meant to fight maybe with 318 soldiers, maybe only with his assistant Eliezer, and he fought against those 4 powerful kings that defeated the 5, which were weaker. Subsequently, after Abram defeated them, he was able to take Lot out of captivity, and even the king of Sodom was very impressed about Abram's behavior, although didn't treat him in a very nice way later on in the entire story. When the actual attack took place, the Torah describes it in Perek Vav Bereshis, in Perek Yadai, excuse me, Vayachalek elem laila hu v'avadav vayakem v'yidufim ad chova asher mismol Damascus. The actual battle against the 4 kings, Avram divided his division at night. That's the literal interpretation of Vayachalekem Laila, but our rabbis tell us that this war took place on Seder night at midnight, when Avram Avinu went all the way and conquered Eretz Yisrael to the northernmost area, even in Syria, north of Damascus, which was the greater boundary of Eretz Yisrael. The first time in Jewish history that a Hebrew actually had conquered Eretz Yisrael was on Seder night, and this was in order to rescue Lot, Avram's nephew, from the captivity. And this set a standard for the years to come, that when the Jews would be released from Egypt en route towards Eretz Yisrael, this would also happen at midnight of the 15th of Nisan. In Parshas Vayera and Perek Aleph of Bereshit, the angels come to visit Avram and Sarah and to promise her that within a year's time she's going to have a baby. Okay, Tchaya Tchoveket Ben, within a year you're going to have a baby. In the next chapter, right after that, that the birth was in Genesis 21, the visit was in Genesis 18, and in chapter 19, the 2 of those angels went the same evening to Sodom to warn Lot about the overthrowing of the city. And Lot bakes for them matzah and they eat it. Medrash Rabbah there, and Rashi also on the spot in Genesis 19 verse 2 says that why did Lot bake matzah for the angels? Because it was Pesach. Now, it sounds a little bit far-fetched because the miracle of the redemption from Egypt occurred hundreds of years later. At the time when this story occurred, there wasn't a single Jew enslaved in Egypt. What was the point of baking matzahs then? Even if you take the Gemara in Yoma, which claims that Avram Avinu had fulfilled the mitzvahs even before he was commanded, it still sounds a little bit far-fetched to command to fulfill a mitzvah, which has a very specific historical context before the historical event actually happened. And that's why it sounds a little bit fascinating that Lot would actually bake matzah, which he probably learned about doing from his uncle Abraham, before the act actually occurred. One of the Torah scholars of our generation, Rav Yoel Ben Nun, wrote an article about many comparisons that he finds between the story in Sodom and the story of the Pesach and Yetzias Mitzrayim, trying to explain the logic in the baking of the matzah by Lot, and Rav Meidan also, his Talmud, describes that more in detail. But in any event, what it definitely relates is that this occurred on Seder night, and consequently, if on the same day earlier the angel had visited, the angels Avram and Sarah, they were promised that in a year Yitzchak would be born, namely that he was born on Pesach. Because if the same evening, which was Pesach already, Lot offered matzah for the angels, that means at least on Erev Pesach or during Pesach itself, the angels promised the birth a year later. It's true that the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Aleph quotes that there were 3 women who were remembered on Rosh Hashanah, Sarah, Rachel, and Chana. And indeed, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the Kriyas Torah talks about the remembering that Hashem had of Sarah in Genesis 21 when Yitzchak was born and the bris was fulfilled and made by Avram when Yitzchak was 8 days of age. And the Haftorah on that very same day, first day of Rosh Hashanah, talks about Chana having the privilege of having the labor to bear Shmuel, to be her first son after a long period of being barren. And according to the rabbis, Rachel was also mentioned in her tears on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and that is talking about the exile of her children also relates to the fact that she also became pregnant in Rosh Hashanah. So Sarah, Rachel, and Chana all became pregnant on Rosh Hashanah. Not surprising that the Torah and Haftorah reading on first day Rosh Hashanah talks about having babies, because essentially Rosh Hashanah is a day which commemorates the birth of the mankind, the universe Hashem started to create, as the Ran says, on 25th of Elul. The sixth day of creation on Rosh Hashanah is the day when Adam was born, and the continuation of multiplying is where the human race continues what Hashem had started when he formed Avram and everybody, Adam Rishon, and everybody since then is carrying on that mission. To that end, Noam, to that end, Yitzchak is born in the 7th month of the pregnancy, if we assume that his mother became pregnant on Rosh Hashanah.
Good.
Okay. And that's not overly surprising. Already at the time of the Gemara, people knew that in the 7th month there were a lot of premature babies. Not only that, the mother didn't even wait till the end of the 7th month. The pregnancy and the delivery took place within less than 7. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu was born in the earlier part of the 7th month. That's why his mother Yocheved was able to hide him for 3 months, according to the simplistic understanding of the Psukim in Exodus number 1. And according to our rabbinical tradition, Shmuel HaNavi was also born in the earlier part of the 7th month. So I'd like to summarize where we're standing at this moment in time. When describing the concept of Masa Avot Siman Labani, that the patriarchs often determine historically what happens to us in later periods of history, the first example, which the Ramban talks about in Genesis 12, verse 6, is about the famine in Eretz Yisrael, which caused Avraham Avinu to go to Egypt. And the Ramban criticizes that behavior and declares that part of the reason why the Jews eventually were enslaved in Egypt due to a famine started off with Avraham Avinu not remaining in Canaan and withstanding the trial at that period. What I said is that in Pirkei Avos it doesn't seem to be that way, because there it mentions in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos that Avraham Avinu was tested in 10 issues and he actually was successful in all of them. And one of them, which most of the commentaries mention, was the famine in Eretz Yisrael then, and it seems like it wasn't criticized for his behavior. And indeed, the Maharal takes issue and others with the Ramban's approach. But nevertheless, the principle that Avraham Avinu set a standard for historical future is true, and Ramban also criticizes in the Radak Sarah for teasing and almost torturing a little bit Agar for her behavior, and which resulted in the Jews suffering for many years in the Muslim countries from the behavior of Ishmael. To that end, the first war that Avraham Avinu was involved in sparing his nephew Lot, according to Chazal, occurred on Seder night, and that's why the Torah uses the expression Vayachalek elem laila, because actually at midnight, when the plague of the firstborn occurred in Egypt, it was at the same time when Avraham Avinu actually fought to spare his nephew and set the tone, because he conquered Eretz Yisrael completely at that stage, certainly to the northernmost border, even north of Damascus. Yet, there are other miracles that occurred on Pesach. One of them we had just mentioned, that Yitzchak was born on Pesach, and so was the angel visiting Lot and saving Lot from Sodom. Yitzchak, being born on Pesach many years later, decided to bless his kids. Without going into a long discussion on it, he was 123 years of age when he decided to bless his 2 sons, Esav and maybe Yaakov as well. He didn't mention Yaakov, but Rivka overheard the conversation and caused Yaakov to intercept the blessing given of Esav, first of all. And why was he 123 in very brief terms? Because Avram was 86 when Ishmael was born. That's found at the end of chapter 16 of Bereshis. And he was 100 years old when Yitzchak was born. That's in chapter 21 of Bereshis, meaning that Ishmael was 14 years older than Yitzchak, and Ishmael died when he was 137. That's mentioned in Parshas Todos, meaning that Yitzchak at that stage was 123. So when he saw that his older brother had died, he started to worry about his future, and he blesses his two sons, originally thinking of blessing Esav, on his birthday, on Pesach itself. How do we get to the idea that he was about to bless them on his birthday? Because what Yaakov brings later on when getting the blessing from his father were two he-goats. So although Rashi mentions that Rivka assigned him to bring the he-goats because that was part of the ketubah that she was promised to have two of them per day, and it was something that belonged to her. But our rabbis tell us that it was the Pesach evening, and the two he-goats are one for the Pesach and one for the Chagiga, which accompanies the Pesach. And on top of it, Yaakov actually brought wine. And the Mefarshim say that even the 4 cups, which is a rabbinical law, Yitzchak was also keeping. It happened to be his birthday, and on a birthday, the Ben Ish Chai and the Bavitcher Rebbe, as Yochanan Levracha mentioned, that a person has a capability to bless people for the day that Hashem had blessed him with life. And Yitzchak, in any event, took his great power and was able to bless them on that very special day, which is a day in historical terms, which has long-term consequences for Am Yisrael. In any event, even though Yitzchak originally didn't know that he was blessing Yaakov when he gave him the physical blessing, but later on at the beginning of Perek Kafchet, at the real end of Parshas Toldos, Yaakov is called into Yitzchak when he knew that this was Yaakov, and he blessed him, V'yiten lechat birkat Avraham l'chal zachar itach, l'rishtecha et eretz megurecha asher natan Elokim la'Avraham. Namely, that Yitzchak blessed Yaakov that he would be granted the blessing of Avram, which is Eretz Yisrael. We mentioned in a different context that when Avram did the bris milah for himself and his family members, it says there, "V'natati v'chala zarcha acharecha et Eretz migurecha et kol Eretz Knan v'iti lachem le'elokim." That's in chapter 17, verse 7, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Zayin of Bereshit, when the mitzvah of bris milah is being performed. And there we see the direct link between the bris and Eretz Yisrael, and when Yitzchak blesses Yaakov that he will continue to receive the blessing of Avram Avinu, that is when Eretz Yisrael is granted him. This is also related to the Seder table evening, Pesach Eve. According to our rabbinical tradition, many, many years later, after the Assyrians had taken over the 10 tribes and sent them on exile from Eretz Yisrael, they continued in their pursuit towards Judah as well. We're almost on the entrance to Yerushalayim after taking a considerate part of the Judean area under their occupation. But before Yerushalayim was to be taken, he asked his officials to show him that city, and he saw how tiny it was. And he said to his officials, "This is the city that people talk about all the time. I see how tiny it is compared to what I've done till now. I'll give you a break. You guys will go ahead and fight there tomorrow. Tonight you'll have a break." On that very evening, the plague occurred to the Assyrian leadership, the military heroes, and 185,000 of them died. This is mentioned both in Melachim Beis in the 19th chapter and also in Yeshayahu in chapter 37. And basically, even in historical recollection, there was a downfall of Sancheriv, which he tries to belittle because of his loss, but it is a well-known historical event. And our rabbis tell us that this actually occurred on Seder night, and it is found in the poem as well. So these are some of the wonders that occurred on this special evening, the birth of Yitzchak, the blessing that Yitzchak gave on his birthday to Yaakov Avinu to take Eretz Yisrael like Avram Avinu did many years before. And even though the Samaritan Jews were taken by the Assyrians out of Eretz Yisrael, Judea was saved thanks to the bitachon of Chizkiyahu, which related a major victory on Seder night when 185,000 of the military of Sancheriv died in a plague. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that all these were relatively high-ranked officials who died in this miraculous event. If we go now a little bit towards the simanim of the Seder itself, you will see that the Kadesh Urchatz pattern is originated already from the time of Rashi's Talmidim many, many years ago. over 900 years ago. And we'll talk about some of the features that are unique to those simanim in relation to Pesach compared to other uh, days of festivity like Shabbos and festivals. First of all, I will say that there are fundamentally 5 biblical and rabbinical mitzvot, respectively, which apply specifically to the Seder night. 2 of them are definitely biblical, namely the storytelling of what happened in Egypt and also the eating of matzah even nowadays. 2 of these issues are rabbinical nowadays. One is the eating of the bitter herbs, that is when there isn't a Beis Hamikdash, and the drinking of the 4 cups was always a rabbinical issue in the first place. What is debatable as to whether it's considered biblical or not is the recital of the Hallel, which is said during the Seder. I'm not talking about the Hallel that is said in the synagogue. I'm talking about the Hallel said in the Seder. As many of you remember from your days of Chutz La'aretz, the Ashkenazim or non-Hasidim don't say Hallel on Seder night at all in Shul, but the Hasidim and many of the other groups do. And here in Eretz Yisrael, the prevalent custom is wherever there is tzibur to definitely say the Hallel on Seder night. There is a debate this year with the coronavirus, if people are not able to go to Shul, whether to say the Hallel at night as part of the tefillah. I feel that it is correct to say it, whether you want to say it with a bracha or not. There are opinions one way or the other. Either way is acceptable. Be it as it may, there are 3 features related to the Kiddush that are said on Seder night compared to a regular Shabbat. Number 1, that each one of the participants should drink, if they can, of course, depending on medical regulations, up to 44 cc at least of grape juice or wine if applicable, and that the cup, each person should drink that way, not that one person drinks for others or drinks the main amount. Each person does it on his own. If a person, at least in the first cup, can have a little bit of wine, it would be better because it's a day of freedom and grape juice doesn't really give that reflection. It may be considered wine halachically, but isn't give a strong sense of freedom, and therefore it's better to use wine literally. At least you want to share wine and grape juice, better yet, if otherwise you may be too tired. And also the way that we drink it, we're supposed to drink it reclining. And as you know, if you have at least a pillow and feel a bit convenient when drinking it, it would be better to drink the wine or the grape juice in that mode. There are 4 cups that we drink during the Seder, and the Ashkenazi custom is to make a blessing, a Borei Pri Hagafen on each one. And that's despite the fact that usually if you have a meal, let's say on Shabbat, and you know that you're going to drink a couple of cups of wine during the course of the meal, and you made Kiddush first, you don't need to make a bracha again for what you're about to drink during the meal. And here we do know about it. But the commentators explain that the reason is that each one of the 4 cups that we drink reflects another mitzvah and feature that relates to this evening. The first one is like the Kiddush, which in the yeshivish world is called the matir, what permits me to go ahead and have the meal. Matir allows me. The second one is for the Seder Haggadah, the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzat Mitzrayim. We drink that one when we finish saying the entire Magid and the 2 first portions of the Hallel. The third one for the grace after meals when we finish the entire meal. And the 4th one after saying the Hallel. And then we have the Hallel to complete and the songs that are said at the end of the Seder. So each one of them represents a separate mitzvah. So therefore it also has a separate benediction and bracha. You don't make a bracha on it except on the 4th one, even if you drink a serious amount of grape juice or wine for each one of the cups. The only time you make the final bracha is after you drink the 4th cup. The urchatz, we wash our hands. Some, only the conductor of the Seder does it. That was the German Jewish custom, and some others follow that direction. It itself, the reason why having to wash is a little bit interesting, because we're actually only eating a vegetable then, parsley, potato, or one of these green leaf types of food. Usually on a regular day, we wouldn't probably wash for that, although there are opinions already in the Gemara, let alone in the Middle Ages and later, who claim that if you dip vegetables in water or in salt water like we do at the Seder table, it requires a washing anytime you do that. The only thing is on Pesach, it's mandatory as part of the ritual. But I believe that many people on a regular basis do not wash for that. And part of the reason we eat the vegetable in the first place, as the Gemara says, to bring the children to ask why are we doing this. It's not even serving as a real appetizer, because the amount we eat from that vegetable is minimal. And on top of it, we have a long Haggadah to actually read, which will probably take at least an hour anyhow till we get to the matzah that we're about to eat. How effective would that serve as an appetizer with a minimal amount of vegetable to start off the meal was rather questionable. And part of the issue was to bring them to ask the question why we do so. The prevalent custom is to make a bori priyadama on the vegetable and have in mind for the bitter herbs the more that we're going to eat much later. And since you have in mind and you know that you're going to be eating it later, it is included in the benediction that we said already and serves as an introduction for what's going to happen later. In addition, the more common custom is to eat less than a kazayit of it in order not to get into a question whether you need to make a bracha achrona because we haven't had matzah yet, we haven't started a real meal. But the Vilna Gaon says you do eat a kazayit, and nevertheless there are poskim that say that even those who eat a kazayit for the actual vegetable will not make a bracha achrona on it, but will actually have the maror to complete the procedure later on. If we assume that this vegetable being eaten is like a promo for the maror, then you may have to eat it not reclining, and like we do with the maror as well. And I believe that that is normally the custom anyhow, that people only recline for the drinking of the 4 cups and the eating of the matzah itself. Whether you use parsley or you use any other green vegetable or a potato, it doesn't really matter. Any one of them can serve for this purpose. If each one of the family members washes his hand for that, then there's room for it, because on this evening of Seder, we take all the stringencies that apply to Dinei Seuda more than any other time of the year. And since there are definitely opinions who claim that for a vegetable with salt, you do, or water that it dips into a liquid, requires netilas, we do that as well, but you don't make a bracha on it, and you carry on immediately afterwards with the Haggadah procedures. Subsequently, after eating the vegetable, we break the second matzah into 2, and the larger portion we hide or put aside for the afikolah. I mentioned that it's matzah number 2, but I didn't get into the general discussion, which seems to be obvious to so many Jews, that we need to have 3 matzahs at the Seder table. In actual fact, this is not universally accepted. The Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and perhaps also the Rif, and a few others may say that you only need 2 matzahs at the Seder. And the fact of the matter is that when the Seder begins, the 2 matzahs are still complete. Only when we break the matzah at the stage of the yachatz is one of them broken. So the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo says, and that's the most important source that led to the prevalent custom of having 3 matzahs, that if you want to maintain the concept of Lechem Mishnah and you are breaking the second matzah, where are you going to have 2 matzahs when you get to the bracha of Motzi Lechem Min Haaretz and Al Chilat Matzah? You don't have 2 complete matzot for that. And since we follow the opinion, which itself was in the Middle Ages debated, that the manna did not actually come down on Yom Tov, like on Shabbos it didn't come down, and therefore it's compulsory to have a Lechem Mishnah on Yom Tov similar to that of Shabbat. Therefore, in order to ensure that I'll have 2 complete matzahs at the time of the bracha, it makes sense to have a 3rd matzah. However, the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and perhaps others claim that this evening there's a mitzvah in specific to make a bracha on the broken matzah, because the Torah defines the matzah as lechem oni, first of all with a small cholam, meaning poor bread. And the Gemara in Psachim says that poor bread reflects that a poor person usually doesn't have the complete one. And the fact that it's broken is part of the educational tool this evening to show the situation that we were in. And that's why the poor person would actually have a broken matzah. And don't forget, when we set the table, we still had 2 complete ones. So there was definitely a lechem mishnah. When we were in school, and there are people still believe that to be of great importance, they claim that 3 matzahs resemble Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. But that resembles me the story of the hen and the egg. Meaning, if you really assume that there are meant to be 3 matzahs, like with Yosef Karo, And you can say they commemorate Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. But if you follow the Rambam, the Gra, and say that there's only two, then I, for example, am not a Kohen or a Levi. I would be left out. It would sound that way. In any event, the prevailing custom is to have three, and then even if you were to have two, the one that's the second one is the one that you break. The reason why you take the larger slice for the purpose of the afikomen and hide it till then is because the afikomen itself needs, for the sake of its mitzvah to resemble the Korban Pesach, a substantial amount of matzah, and therefore we need a larger slice for that purpose. In truth, maybe this year, because of the coronavirus, we're not going to have many people around us during the Seder. But in a regular year where, Baruch Hashem, you have many family members or others or guests with you, so you need much more than the afikomen matzah for accommodating all the people who are sharing the meal. But at least symbolically, when you're taking the larger slice and designating that one for the purpose of the afikomen, you show that it is important to you, and therefore the larger slice will be left for that. We'll see later on that the smaller slice, which remains anyhow with the matzah plate, is going to be used subsequently in the course of the Haggadah. After the matzah is broken, we pour the wine into the cups. Even though we're going to drink it much later, we pour it in before we start singing Manishtana. Part of the reason is to show the change that occurs during the course of the evening. The Mishnah mentions that the format for the Haggadah is Matchil begnut sayem b'shvach. You start off with the negative and you move on to the praiseworthy, and therefore we actually pour the wine in before getting into the whole presentation of the Haggadah. And we'll drink that cup after completing the entire story until we are about to celebrate, including the two first chapters of the Hallel. And indeed, we have a special text that we say in the Haggadah when we drink the second cup, Asher Galanu v'Ga'alu Davotenu Mitzrayim. We talk very specifically about this cup that actually originally symbolized servitude and maybe punishment, and it ends up to be a cup of reward and redemption. In Megillas Eicha, when the person making the lamentation is talking about the Edomites and criticizing them, he mentions Gam alayich tavor kos tishkari v'titari. The Edomites, who resemble the Romans who destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, are going to drink from the cup of punishment and are going to be penalized. So chas v'shalom, at the beginning, when we were still in servitude in Egypt and not acting in a proper manner, we could have been subject to penalty. And thank goodness the cup itself turns out to be a cup of Geula. And as I mentioned earlier, Yaakov Avinu brought Yitzchak for his birthday wine, which was also Seder night. And that is part of the change and challenge that the Jewish people are going to move from a position of servitude to later on a position of redemption. And part of Yitzchak's guarantee to Yaakov is that it's going to happen in the years to come. The questions that we ask at the Manishtan are different than what were asked in the time of the Mishnah. But the Mishnayot and Masechet Psachim, Tamid, and Midot were edited while the Second Temple was still around. And there they talk about the Paschal Lamb and about the roasting of the meat, things which today you're not supposed to do. We don't have a Korban Pesach, and on Seder night, one should avoid roasting red meat. If you have chicken, it's one thing, but red meat, definitely not. And to that end, we are asking the questions which became relevant only after the Churban and not before. It is important to realize that because, as you know, part of the text of the Haggadah is written in Aramaic, clearly indicating where the Jews were living at that time. And we say that in the Halach Ma'anya, Hashata Hacha L'Shana Ba B'Arad Yisrael, we are now physically outside of Eretz Yisrael, and the year forthcoming will be there. So even if we are, Baruch Hashem, today merited to live in Eretz Yisrael, we haven't changed the fundamental text which was formed while the Jews were living outside of the country. And in any event, we don't have the ability to bring the Paschal Lamb today either, even though we are in Yerushalayim. The biblical mitzvah to storytell Yetzias Mitzrayim is fundamentally the main part of the Magid. And part of the mitzvah is to have it with the setup of a table with all the main components of food around the table. And we are trying to visualize to the children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, the meaning. Even if this year, unfortunately, you will have to do a Seder in a small group of people, it still is a feature that we celebrate, even when we don't have other people with us. We feel and remember what is the meaning and what type of gratitude we have towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this wonderful occasion of being at the Seder. And I think specifically this year, we should have more intention than normal when we say the Shechiyanu, Baruch Hashem, for those who survive from the virus and Has v'shalom should not be affected at all medically by it. It's something to give a greater word of thanks to our HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who spares us from any trouble. In the time of Maimonides, it was actually common even to do the storytelling when a person was reclining because of the feeling of freedom. I believe nowadays it's less comfortable for people to do so. And in the modern Orthodox, it's even sometimes customarily done that people sit on the sofa in the lounge when they do the Magid in order to make a nice thorough discussion. I think there's a little bit of a mistake related to that thinking because it is fundamentally important to make the story around the table where a person's eating. That's part of the visualizing, which is unique to this evening. And we want the children to actually be exposed to what's going on in the meal and to be able to ask the questions on their own. To the extent that many claim that the Manishtana was designated particularly for children who don't have enough observation of their own to come up with the questions, and therefore we pre-dictate to them certain questions that they should ask. But ultimately, if they would be able to get to the questions on their own without the specific format that is mentioned, it would have been a better approach. After the Magid, we go ahead and wash our hands, this time with a bracha, because we're about to eat the matzah. In fact, it is preferable that from the time we wash the hands, then one should try to refrain from talking until you complete eating the sandwich, because there are three elements that are about to come one after the other. One is the eating of the matzah alone, then the maror alone, and then the sandwich of them put together. The matzah has to be eaten alone because it's a biblical obligation. And that is true even when there isn't a temple, whereas the bitter herbs, the maror, is only biblical when the Korban Pesach is applicable. And to that end, we have to eat the matzah without tasting anything else at that time when we eat it first. Not only that, those people who normally eat bread with salt when they have their meal during the week, or even more so on Shabbat, at the Seder table, the poskim say not to put salt on the matzah, but in the morning already they do so during the day, not at night. Likewise, the shank bone, which is used as part of the kahara, we don't eat it at the Seder either because it is roasted meat, but you can eat it on the next morning. And if you keep two stern like the Jews in Chutz La'aretz, then on the second day following the second Seder, but not during the nights when it is forbidden. When one slices the matzahs at motzi matzah, what you're supposed to do essentially is to hold on to the two matzahs that you still have, the first two, one that's complete and one that's broken, and focus on holding on the broken one as well, because we say two benedictions on that matzah. Usually only make one of hamotzi. Sfardim during the year maybe even make mazonos, but the second bracha that is said is al achilat matzah, and that's unique only for the Seder table. And since the specific mitzvah at the Seder table is actually for the poor bread or for the broken one, it is essential that one makes the benediction for motzi matzah when holding on to the second matzah in addition to the first one. The first one's still complete, the second one is broken. There's nothing wrong if you want to hold on to the third one as well, but the point is that the third one will be used in the sandwich that we'll talk about later. When you eat the matzah alone, then, as I said, you eat it without salt and try to eat as much as you can based on what the medical situation enables you. Then when you get to and that should be eaten reclining as well. When you eat the bitter herbs later on, you also should have, for the first time, a substantial amount of lettuce, or if you still eat grain, you can use that. But you have to eat a substantial amount because there's a special bracha for it. And one of the great scholars in Germany claimed that because of the bracha, it's an indication that you need to have a serious quantity of it when you're eating at least a kazait, and that could be quite substantial. When you have the sandwich comes right afterwards, then you don't need to take a very large kazait, neither of the matzah or the bitter herbs, because that is merely a custom. The sandwich is specifically designated to remind us of the destruction of the temple, and that's why it's called Zecher LaMikdash Kehilel. There are 3 points during the Seder where we actually remember the temple destruction. One is the sandwich, one later on when the Ashkenazim eat an egg during the course of the meal, at least part of it, to resemble that Seder night is the same week night of Tisha B'Av in the course of that same year later on. And the third one, towards the end of Seder, when we say L'Shana B'Av Yerushalayim, when we're looking forward to see a more completed fulfillment of the Seder. As it were, the eating of the sandwich should include as much as you can the matzah and the lettuce together with the charoset. Charoset you had already for the lettuce when you're eating the maror itself, and then when you're eating with the matzah, you do it together. And after you complete that, you start the Yontif meal. As I mentioned, there's at least 5 mitzvot that the Seder, 2 biblical storytelling and eating the matzah, 2 rabbinical, the bitter herbs, and the drinking of the 4 cups, and 1 debatable, the halal. There's another element which is also biblically important, but it's not unique to Pesach, and that is what's called Simchas Yom Tov, to be in an atmosphere of joy. That indeed is imperative at the Seder table, like on other festivals, maybe even more than regular, because of the sense of freedom and the renewal of the Jewish people. I will continue this session, Yitz Hashem, in one more part in one of my next shiurim. I will end here and add just one blessing as we are getting close to Shabbos Hagadol, this forthcoming Shabbos, that we should be merited to see what the Navi Malachi had said, Hinanochi Sholech Lachem. I am about to send you it, Eliah Navi, Elijah the prophet Lifnei Bo Yom Hashem Hagadol. We're looking forward to see a time when the righteous people like you shall be able to see the divine salvation and completion, and especially this year with the plague that we were not expecting ahead of time, that Hashem should bless us all with good health and being able to celebrate the Pesach with genuine freedom. Chag Sameach. I will give an additional session on Sunday.